This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Welcome to this Sydney Writers' Festival panel discussion with the provocative and grammatically confusing title, No He Can't, ? It's a question mark about Barack Obama, about Obama's America, and about its role in the world. My name is Jeff Garrett. I'm the Chief Executive of the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, and it's my real pleasure to be here this morning with all of you to moderate a discussion that I'm sure is going to be fascinating. It's less than 2 years after people all around the world were swept up in Barack Obama's extraordinary and probably unprecedented "yes, we can" promise on the election trail to be next American president, affecting people on all sides of politics, people in the United States, people all around the world. But today, the session title for our panel reflects a new reality. So we've gone from the "yes, we can" promise of a Barack Obama presidential candidate to the reality of the Obama administration, in which people are whispering and sometimes shouting, or sometimes shouting, "No, he can't," and other times questioning, "Perhaps he can't." Today we're going to discuss this topic not in the policy wonkish minutiae of what was in the US healthcare reform bill, what's going to be in the financial reform bill, maybe passed later this week, or how the troop surge in Afghanistan is going. Rather, this session is designed to be about the big picture on Obama, what his presidency has meant so far for Americans, Australians, and people around the world, and what his presidency might mean in the future for us all. It's clear that Barack Obama entered office both with unprecedented expectations and unprecedented challenges. In addition to being faced with the challenge of ending 2 long wars and fighting off the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, Obama was also supposed to restore his country's standing, both among its own people and among people all around the world. After the in-your-face unilateralism of Bush foreign policy and the charge that President Bush aided, abetted, or ignored the gargantuan excesses of Wall Street to create the global financial crisis, today we have to ask the question, how is Obama doing in rising to the challenge? Rising politically in terms of his policy leadership and personally as president. I'm on the stage with 3 superb panelists who are very well equipped to rise to the challenge of analysing Obama. Ann Davies on my far right has just returned from a 3-year stint as Washington correspondent for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, where she offered insightful and minute-by-minute, I have to say, coverage of the 2008 presidential election. She served previously as the Sydney Morning Herald State Political Editor and Urban Affairs Editor, exposing, among other things, links between property developers and local politics in New South Wales, obviously a topic of ongoing concern. Her work with Kate McClymont helped her win a Gold Walkley for her coverage of the previous salary cap scandal in sports affecting the Canterbury Bulldogs almost 10 years ago, I think it was. Christopher Hitchens to my left, and I'll quote from The Observer, is one of the most prolific as well as brilliant journalists of our time, and I was told to say he's also widely published, a polemicist and a frequent radio and TV commentator. I have to say whoever wrote this script believed in understatement. Christopher Hitchens is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair. He's a visiting professor at the New School in New York, and I think you have an affiliation with the Hoover Institution at Stanford and the Atlantic Monthly. His numerous books include the recent international bestseller, God is Not Great, not a very provocative title, and he's in Australia, among other things, talking about his latest book, Hitch 22, a Memoir. Last but certainly not least, to my immediate right is Don Watson. Don Watson's American Journeys, a book about his time in the United States in the run-up to the Obama presidency, won the Age Nonfiction and Book of the Year awards in 2008. It also won the inaugural Indie Award for Nonfiction and the Walkley Award for Nonfiction. His earlier Recollections of a Bleeding Heart won the Age Book of the Year and Non-Fiction prizes, the Courier Mail Book of the Year, National Biography Award, Australian Literary Studies Book of the Year Award. His best-selling Death Sentence won the Australian Booksellers Association Book of the Year in 2003. So we have a very distinguished...
You didn't mention any of my prizes.
You didn't mention my affiliation.
How should I feel?
I think you should take that up with your publicist, because I'm only doing what I was told. And I'm sure you're not in a position to speak for yourself on any of these matters. So.
No, sir.
Without further ado, I'll try to take one giant step back here and put our panellists in the limelight. I can see that some of them are at least itching for that role. So let me start with just an overall reactions, a sort of quick reactions from the panel on this question of, has Obama, yes we can, turned into Obama, no he can't? And perhaps we might start with you on this question.
Well, I think that's a little bit of an unfair assessment that he can't. I actually think he's made two pretty big steps forward. One is the healthcare reforms, which measured against Australian standards are a little bit wimpy, but in the American context, I think they will make quite a big difference to the lives of the 47 million people who didn't have insurance, and also the people who found themselves unable to be insured because they had pre-existing conditions. And overnight, we've had the financial reforms come through. So, I think he's achieved two things that in 10 years' time people will see as pretty significant. Perhaps not the sort of things that capture the heart, perhaps not the things that inspire hope and give the great big vision that we saw in the election. But I think they'll be significant.
But that is the big point, isn't it, Christopher Hitchens, that back on the campaign trail, the winning and now we think plagiarised photograph poster was about hope. And it was change you can believe in, and a whole new generations of Americans involved in politics, and now they seem disenchanted again, and we have things like the Tea Party emerging. Anne's just documented the two big legislative achievements of Obama, but how do you think he's doing politically, living up to the promise or otherwise?
Well, just to scroll back to the starting point, during the campaign I wrote an attack on the slogan, yes we can, saying that was one of the most infantile and vapid slogans that ever been. So it sounded like desperate parents trying to teach potty training to a recalcitrant, yes, we can. And I was very relieved to find in David Remnick's excellent new biography, which I recommend, of the president, that Obama always thought it was a silly slogan as well. That gave me a certain amount of comfort and reassurance, because the reason I voted for him, not just negatively in that I couldn't conceivably vote for McCain-Palin, but positively, was I thought he was a good writer. Language is my business, it's all I really care about. It's one of the very few things I can say I know anything about. The person revealed in his extremely well-written first volume, at any rate, is a very open-minded, very curious, self-critical, humorous individual. And I was very pleased to find he hadn't fallen for his own propaganda. I always think that's an excellent start. The problem with open-mindedness is it can become empty-mindedness or neutrality, and my principal interest is in foreign policy, especially in the war between civilization and its declared enemies. And I think it is probably not the case that the differences between the United States and Iran, for example, or rather the Islamic Republic of Iran, or North Korea, arise from cultural misunderstandings. I don't think that's true. I think it's a soft interpretation that won't and doesn't survive collision with the evidence. My impression is the President is a much tougher person on this than he looks, or than he's chosen to present himself as being, but have I already talked too much? Someone better tell me. Well, she was so admirably terse that I...
Don, so we had two different versions of Obama. Anne went, despite my protestations, with the policy wonk. Let's dig into the 1,000-page healthcare and finance bills and find all the good that Obama's done. Christopher came back with Obama as a literary cultural figure who may have a lot of steel inside those Miles Davis cool bones and clothes that he wears. Where do you stand on this perspective?
Well, I'm weirdly optimistic. I just read the Remnick biography too, and he does. I'm not optimistic by nature at all, and Obama's the first person to make me feel optimistic for a very long while, and it's mainly because I think that the base metal of Obama is pragmatic. I mean, I don't think he starts with ideals and then compromises them down, which is where most of a great many of his supporters start from. I think he starts from power. He understands that to succeed, you begin with power, and everything you do is about power. And I think you need to do that, particularly in American politics. You know, the left is very disappointed with him, but for what reason, I don't entirely understand. I don't know how he was going to get a public option through on the health bill. He barely got through a Republican option on the health bill. So why would you be carrying on about the public option? I mean, in some ways the answer to the question is we don't know yet. It's a story that's unfolding, as they say on the media, whether he can or he can't. But I don't think he's done too badly. And I think also this, it always seems to me that America is in a, you know, Elias Canetti said that democratic politics, this is roughly paraphrasing, democratic politics is the Civil War continued with, but they've renounced the killing. And in a way that's sort of cutely true in most advanced democracies, but in America it seems palpably true. And they haven't quite renounced the killing. And the Civil War itself continues for an eighth of the population who never got their just desert. And it continues, the Frontier War continues. In a way, Bush was a continuation of the Frontier War. Palin's a continuation of the Frontier War. The Revolutionary War continues in the Tea Parties. The white trash who provided the cannon fodder for the Civil War still alive and well and galloping through the hills. And in a way, Obama's, as somebody said, his preternatural calm is precisely what the country needs, and I think in a way that's why they voted for him. A lot of people voted for him, that not because he was an idealist, he never presented himself in that way, really, but because he offered some alternative to the war, in a sort of Hobbesian sense. He was the person who provided the assurance that the war would not break out.
Don, that I think, I'm shuffling my notes here because I wanted to read a couple of quotations and get your reactions, the panel's reactions to them from some prominent journalists of late. And this question about who is Obama, is he a pragmatist, idealist, etc., is obviously one that a lot of people are concerned about. Remnick is concerned about it too in his biography. So I want to read you a quotation that I'm going to put under the header, Obama as human Rorschach test, what you see in him, whatever you want to see. And this is from Frank Rich in the New York Times in April. Christopher, perhaps you could react to it. Depending on where you stand or the given day, he is either an over-intellectual professorial wuss or a ruthless Chicago machine pole rivaling the original Boss Daley. He's either a socialist redistributing wealth to the undeserving poor or a tool of the Wall Street Goldman Sachs elite. He is a terrorist coddling ACLU tilting lawyer or the closet Cheneyite upholding the worst excesses of the Bush administration's end run on the Constitution. He's a lightweight celebrity who's clueless without a teleprompter or a Machiavellian mastermind who has ingeniously forged his Hawaiian birth certificate, covered up his ties to Islamic radicals and bamboozled the entire mainstream press. He's the reincarnation of JFK, LBJ, FDR, Reagan, Hitler, Stalin, Adlai Stevenson, or Nelson Mandela. Who is Obamable? Is he knowable or unknowable? And is it a plus or a minus to his presidency that people still don't think they know who the president is?
Well, to paraphrase something once said by Penelope Gilliard, one of the classic sounds of the New York Sunday morning is that of Frank Rich barking up the wrong tree. In this case, every tree in sight. Obama is not centre-left, but he's left of centre. He's never pretended to be anything else. his single most attractive quality, I think, is the belief in his own luck. You remember that was what Bonaparte thought was the only qualification for generalship. Is he lucky? Obama knows he's been fantastically fortunate. Everyone in Chicago got out of his way, either by mortgaging their wives on eBay or being caught leaving the wrong club, or they just all running against him, as the black Republican Alan Keyes did, on the grounds that he, Obama, wasn't really black because he wasn't a descendant of slaves. He was an African. When you get that from the Republican black candidate, you know you're lucky. And Obama knows that about himself. The question is, how long is this luck going to hold? I'll give you an example that everyone will remember perhaps when I mention it, but because of him, his own qualities, has generally been forgotten. You'll recall that an American ship was taken by pirates off Somalia when the president had been in office about 3 months. And someone must have gone to him and said, well, Mr. President, we can either have a hostage standoff negotiation with these people, or we can take it to the United Nations and appeal to the government, such as it is of Somalia, and protract the situation in that way, or we can send the Navy SEALs and tell them to do 4 headshots, there were 4 kidnappers, and bring the ship back. And he must have said the third option is obviously the best one, because the Navy SEALs delivered 4 headshots, just 4. It was all over, and the ship and the crew and the passengers were all back in a few days. Now, that must have taken some nerve in the first few weeks, and it could all have gone fantastically wrong, as every other policy towards Somalia always has. Why isn't it famous? Why isn't it better known about him? Because what would Reagan have done if he'd done that? You'd never have heard the end of it. There had been a big speech saying, USA, USA, we're number one. They can run, but they can't hide. And all that nonsense. Obama didn't boast about it for a second. He basically thought, those who need to know have got the message, and I don't need to brag about it. That I thought was very impressive. That's why I believe, and have written ever since he began running for the nomination, that those who vote for him because they're members of MoveOn.org, who've already proved themselves to be stupid, are stupid twice because they're voting for someone who absolutely doesn't represent or stand for anything that they believe.
So is this humility as charisma? Don, you're pretty good on these personal...
On humility.
You have a lot of it going around and you write about it eloquently. So humility as charisma? Christopher's just said that, that there's something fundamentally wrong about the Obama hype, because everything we see about the guy is about discipline, quiet discipline, pragmatism, all the things one might associate with someone with his academic pedigree, but not what you'd associate with this walk-on-water political candidate who can inspire people all around the world.
No, I think, the reassuring thing about him, I think, is that he's so calculating, and his instincts are very good about when he ought to when not to overplay something. To give you an example, it was galling to see, I'm sure for lots of people left of centre or even right of centre, to see that he decided that he'd solved the great financial meltdown with the people who were largely responsible for it. This was hard to stomach. But then I don't know quite where I read it, but someone pointed out very sensibly that, in a way, if you're dealing with the markets, you're not dealing with a political problem, you're dealing with a market, and a market doesn't think like... A market is concerned that the right people are in the right places, a market's concerned with belief. So if you put Joseph Stiglitz in there, that might make everyone feel better on the left, but it actually won't make the market feel better. They'll feel better if Paulson's there. And in a way, that seems to me quite an astute calculation by Obama, and makes... I think, it was funny that Team of Rivals book came out at the same time as he was running, and it couldn't have been better for him, in a way, because it looked like a Lincolnian moment when you really had to step across to the other side. You couldn't win without doing that. And by stepping across, he confused everybody, which is, I think, the way he operates too. But I think those sorts of calculations are reasons for confidence with him, that he's actually one step ahead of the left who support him all the time. I know Christopher would say that's not hard. But a lot of people can't do it consistently like he does.
Okay, so I think the marks thus far are going pretty strongly in the president's favour. It's just a different Barack Obama maybe than some stereotypes that have prominence. And could I shift to how it's going in terms of global perceptions of the United States? You've been in Washington for a while now. You're back in Sydney. Let me just read a couple of pretty stunning statistics from opinion polls. We can take them with as many helpings of salt as we want. But Pew Global Survey, 2008, in only three of the 23 countries that Pew surveyed was half the population confident about George W. Bush, 3 out of 23. Do the same thing in 2009, it's 18 out of 23 countries expressed confidence in Barack Obama. The average confidence in Bush in 2008, 24% around the world. In 2009 for Obama, 64%. But the favourability of the United States has gone up much less. The favourability rating for the US in Pew in 2008, 46%. 2009, it's 57%. In the Globespan polls, Australians, for example, are only 1 percentage point more likely to view the US as being a mainly positive force in the world than China. The numbers, according to Globespan, are 37%. The US is a positive force, 36% China is a positive force. Barack Obama has improved America's global standing, but it seems he's running far more popularly than his country is. What does that tell us about the world? What does that tell us about Obama, that he's a global rock star, but people in Australia and around the world are still profoundly sceptical about the United States?
Well, I actually think he's made a quite significant difference to the attitudes towards the United States. And rather than battle out the polls, the World Public Opinion poll, which came out in April, the US was viewed positively in 20 out of 28 countries. You know, it's gradually shifting, but I think it takes time because people realise that leaders come and go, and they want to fully understand whether there's been a sort of shift in the way Americans think. So, you know, I think he has made a big difference. And but the exceptions are countries like Pakistan and Turkey, where the US perceptions are getting worse. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for him to manage attitudes in the Middle East towards America. So,
Christopher, I'm sure you have, on this issue, as opposed to all others, I'm sure you have strong views on this one. But the Obama Cairo speech is being lauded around the world, I think. It was a reaching out speech to the Muslim world. It was one in which Obama acknowledged his connections to his personal connections to Muslims. Yet you and others have been quite critical of his standoffish, less decisive policy in the Middle East. How do you weigh this Obama's standing as the world's leader versus American policy and reactions to the US?
Well, I think there's more than one way to measure opinion. For example, to take a country that I have visited a bit and know a bit about, Iran, there's no question that among the Iranian young, George Bush was very popular because they said they heard what they wanted from him. He said, if you're willing to fight for democracy, we're willing to take your side. Iran is a red state in that respect, in many, many ways. And I think the supporters of the president should be depressed that when the young Iranians were being truncheoned into puddles of blood in the street by their theocratic dictators and slave owners, they were shouting, "Obama, where are you?" because they didn't know where he stood. I think that's much more important than any finding by Pew. In his speech to the Iranian people, which was broadcast directly to them, the president said, we want to bring the Islamic Republic of Iran back into the family of nations. Sounds all right. Why is Iran not in the family of nations, though? Which he seems to agree it isn't. Because it's an Islamic Republic is why. That's what keeps it out, because it claims to own everyone in Iran. It has an ideological theory, the Velayat-e-Faqih, that says that everyone, not including people who aren't even Muslim or Shia, is the property of the clergy, is a ward of the theocracy. And because it develops illegal nuclear weapons and has a revolutionary guard that's run a military coup against the people of the country, which is also the possessor of those weapons. These are the reasons it's not in the international community. That's a circle you can't square.
Okay, so Don, you know a thing or two about politicians' speeches. Obama's speeches to the world are all about reaching out. And Christopher said, I think it might be fair to paraphrase what he just said, is reaching out is fine, but you've got to have some principles. And the problem with Obama in the Muslim world is it's been all reach out and no principles. Do you think that, I mean, how should one craft speeches? What's the relationship between speeches and policy?
Well, I suppose that it's a little harder. I mean, Iran might be a red state, but the Middle East is something that he has much less purchase on than he has on the US. And I guess the gap between the Cairo speech and the reality of Middle Eastern politics is always going to be very much wider than any speech he makes domestically. As for the, I mean, I'm sceptical about speeches. I don't know. He's brilliant at them, but I don't know that they actually change much. They just sort of sit there. But I guess the problem is with the reaching out. I mean, if you take the George Bush line, but if you fight for democracy, we'll be by your side, is good, except that it maybe it echoes his father's urging of the Kurdish uprising in Iraq and then not giving them the support they needed. You can get yourself into trouble that way as well, urging people on into a battle that you may not be able to help them win, and the consequences may be terrible. So maybe Obama's motivated a little by that, I don't know.
No, with this, the Kurdish question was Kissinger giving weapons to people saying, we'll back you as long as you fight, then cutting off the weapons and not telling them. That's not the same as a principled stand in favour of Iranian democracy in the least. Anyway, you must therefore be pleased that Bush's son finally helped establish Kurdish autonomy in Iraq in a free Republican Mesopotamia.
Of course.
Though I didn't hear you say so. I'm glad to hear that. On the point of purchase, I'd like to take up on a single word, very important. You wouldn't say, would you, that the United States has no purchase on the government of Israel?
No, I wouldn't.
No. I mean, in other words, if the Israelis are going to continue to build settlements in an identifiable, just a single suburb of Jerusalem, where most of the Arab population can produce documents proving they've owned their homes since before the British Mandate. If American policy can't get them to stop building in that one identifiable suburb of Jerusalem, then there's no such thing as leverage or purchase. And Obama went to all the trouble to point out that this is a terrible thing. He should have said more than he did, in my view, that it's theft as well as an obstacle to negotiations, and then walked away from that. So that a punk government like that of Netanyahu, under the influence of a ratbag religious party, the Shas party, crackpot Orthodox party that happens to run the Ministry of Housing, is allowed to humiliate the United States, not just in the person of its vice president, who was there at the time, but its president and its Congress and its voters. And immediately the president backpedals, and now he's being attacked by some leading American Jewish organizations as being, in principle, anti-Israel. So he's had a fight with one of the Democratic Party's most important voting blocs. He's done nothing for the Palestinians, and he's made himself look like a jerk. This is not impressive.
But when was American policy in the Middle East impressive?
Well, actually, I'll give you an example. When George Bush Sr. Said to the Israelis, if you go on like this, I will ask Congress to suspend your loan guarantees, I thought that was extremely impressive. And so did everyone else in the Middle East, and it led to the nearest we've ever had to a proper peace conference. That was in Madrid. Bill Clinton chose to run that year from the right against Bush, saying that he thought Bush was being soft on Cuba, just like Kennedy. Thought Eisenhower and Nixon were being soft on communism in Cuba, and also from the right on Israel, saying if he was president, the Israelis would not be subjected to this kind of pressure. So the last time that there was an impressive American policy, it was a Republican administration, and it was undone by the hero of every liberal in this room.
Okay, so we
not this liberal.
I'm not sure the great triangulator is a hero of
you know what
all
I mean.
Liberals.
They all thought he was hard done by.
And we just you and I have just listened to an exchange on sort of principle, backbone, rhetorical flourish, etc. I wanted to see if I could just get you to reflect on an added element that seems increasingly in the mix. I'm going to quote from Richard Cohen this week in the Washington Post. I don't know, have you got a one-liner on him?
Yeah.
Maybe we can hold it for a second. Good. So I'm going to call this, I don't think this was the headline writer's tagline, but it's what I would have chosen, which is Obama the Irrelevant. And the theme here was President Obama's visit to the Gulf Coast to look at the oil spill, but apparently, according to most people, not to have done much about it. And Richard Cohen wants to say that that's a metaphor for the Obama presidency. And here's what he said. Obama is presiding over the unpresidable, the president overseeing the incomprehensible. By the way, I'm going for quotations that are supposed to have some literary flavour. Maybe journalists shouldn't be doing this kind of thing, I'm not sure. But the president overseeing the incomprehensible, the full panoply of meaningless power, Air Force One, Marine One, the limo, the motorcade, the briefcase with the nuclear launch codes, all amounting in this case to a man railing against the sea, a sombre lesson for us all. The oil spill goes on, the wars go on, the debt grows, and so, for too many of us, does our denial. The claim here is that the United States is slowly sinking either into a gigantic oil spill or into the in somewhere between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. The US is in terminal decline. Obama can't do much about it. He might sound good, but there are these big realities that he's just not affecting. Is that one overdrawn? Is the US in terminal decline? What should Obama be doing about it?
Well, I think that's the great fear that Americans have. I came back in January and I've noticed since then that the polls are showing that Americans have even got less happy about the direction of their country since when I left. So we've got 23% happy with the direction compared to normally 40%. And I think that's the great problem for America is how do you manage all these problems that they've got around the world? How do you deal with a whole lot of things that they can't really affect? So, for instance, you know, we've got the economy. There's a great fear in America about China. They're much less relaxed about the rise of China than we are in Australia. You've got this mountain of debt, and Americans really grappling. They're not nearly as literate about what debt means and how economies work than, say, Australians. And then, of course, on the left, you've got the concern that America hasn't managed to lead on climate change. On the right, that it's not taking a tough stance on terrorism. So I think there's just this incredible fear that somehow America is losing its place in the world. And that's very hard for Obama to manage. I don't know if we can blame him for the oil spill, but his great challenge over the next 2.5 years before he faces election is to really carve out a much clearer direction of what he's doing. And if the economy improves, I think he's got a much better chance.
So, Don, what do you think about this? So we're both. So it's an objective question. Is the US in terminal decline? And then if you were advising President Obama, depending on your answer to that question, how would you advise him to manage in those waters? I mean,
how to manage America's terminal decline. It's a really big...
Well, it's pretty hard to win elected office in the US saying, we're number 2 and I'm going to get us there. So how, if Barack Obama is a very smart guy, he sees all these challenges, he knows what's going on, how does one lead in that environment?
Well, the example of the oil spill is a good one in a way for the problem that he faces and the madness of modern politics in a way, because you know what Superman would have done. I mean, he would have dived down into the water and plugged the leak. Obama had to stand on the shore and say it's BP's fault and they're going to pay, which is nothing like Superman. And he had to be down there because Bush had got to New Orleans 3 days late. So it was all a bit of a pointless charade.
So it's a matter of expectation, you're quite right.
Yeah.
But is presidency about managing expectation or more than
knowing Richard Cohen, I'm really surprised he left out the Icelandic volcanic ash cloud as well. Obama hadn't dispelled. But the fact remains and has to be faced that in his, I believe it was in his acceptance speech at Chicago, the president did say that we'll be able to date from this the moment when, various spreads of hope and aspiration and so on, and also the moment when the oceans stop rising. I remember thinking, he'll be sorry he said that. He'll be deeply sorry he said that. And also wondering if possibly there wasn't a note of hubris creeping in here. This is the point where the really bad columnist would have mentioned King Canute already, and always, as people do, got it wrong.
Well, one thing that, of course, is coming back is that the citations to Paul Kennedy's 1987, The End of American Empire book are going up again. One looks at the problems in the world and the flight back to the dollar and other things that are happening in global currency markets. Despite all this hand-wringing, it seems that that the world still looks to the United States on so many dimensions. How does one manage that in an environment where it does seem that the levers of power are harder to pull, that they're less effective than they've ever been?
Well, go on, Chris.
No, please.
I was just going to say, it seems to me that a lot of the chickens have yet to come home to roost, really. That in a way, health and even the surge are nothing compared with the domestic problem. I think that they haven't really turned on him yet. The people who are still doing it very hard because of the GFC and the black population hasn't yet got up in the morning and said, well, what have we got out of this guy? Nothing. And the big thing hasn't happened yet, which seems to happen to presidencies. Not a 9/11 necessarily, but there's always something in politics which doesn't go your way, or you've got to try and turn it into making it go your way. And a thing as amorphous as America's alleged decline is not really going to be it. I think it'll be some offshoot of that, or something completely extraneous to the whole problem that will define his presidency.
Okay, so I'm looking at the watch here, and I think we'll get maybe 5 minutes grace at the end of this session. I would like to engage the audience in our conversation soon, so maybe I could end by asking our panelists to a different version of the "Who is Barack Obama?" question. And the stimulus material here is going to be recent American presidents to whom Obama has sometimes been likened. So people on the right like to say that Barack Obama is the second coming of Jimmy Carter. He's got all this pious moralism, but he'll be undone by a combination of economic problems and wars that he doesn't have the stomach for. Barack Obama himself has said, I'm not sure I want to be Bill Clinton so much as Ronald Reagan, and I'm sure at the moment Barack Obama is hoping that his presidency in fact turns out a bit like Reagan's, suffer a big loss in your first midterm referendum, but ride through to a glorious second term in which you change the world. Don, I think we were speaking before and I said I was going to ask you this, Clinton, Reagan, Carter, and you said, well, none of the above. He's like no former president. How do you think we should index Barack Obama?
Well, to be quick, I'd say I hope he's somewhere between Eisenhower and LB James. I hope he's. I mean, I'm a bit of a fan of Eisenhower, and I think the Liberals got it all wrong with Eisenhower. They actually, they were so disappointed that Adlai Stevenson didn't win, but Adlai Stevenson was never really going to be the man. I hope so
in 1950s America was a pretty quiet and boring time. How do you admire this guy who didn't give a particularly good speech, I don't think?
No, but it's not like a simple translation. I think I always feel most comfortable about America when there's someone calm in the centre, and they're usually Republicans, pre-Reaganite Republicans. And I think Johnson has got a bad press too. Take Vietnam out of the way, he's the man who got the Civil Rights Bill through. So, and he's a hard pragmatist. They're the types I like.
Anne?
I don't really think he's like any of the more recent presidents. Perhaps he'll be remembered a little like FDR if he manages to pull off his healthcare reform and can reform it further in his second term, if he has one. I think I agree with Don. I think having someone calm at the centre is pretty important. And one thing I saw an interview he did during the campaign where he said, I'm the sort of guy who doesn't get too high and I don't get too low. And I think that's what America probably needs in a time of quite a lot of turmoil. But that's so interesting, Christopher Hitchens, and this will be the last word from here. Anne and Don have both said it's no drama Obama. That's the bottom line here. That's the guy we want. God, that's a long way from the reason he's in the White House. How do you square those circles?
And I think some distance from reality too, and your mention of high and low is a nice segue to what I wanted to draw your attention to anyway. A detail, but a useful one. The president is a secret smoker. He's his Surgeon General's report is mandated every year by Congress to have a report on the President's health. Says for all his promises to quit, he still hasn't. This argues for me contents under pressure, which is one of my favourite expressions. I like people who are suffering from that. That he does have some sense of the appalling gravity of the office. He knows that at any minute what happened in South Korea yesterday could be repeated, and we'd all be upended into a terrible confrontation that was none of our making. And people would be glad then, would they, that there was no United States superpower? They would think the world was safer if the North Koreans could do that and think that America wouldn't fight. Well, beware of what you want. I think that the President's role models are not presidential. I think that's one of the most attractive things about his writing. His role models are the great leaders of American civil resistance and human rights. People like, of course, Dr. King, but also less likely people like Dorothy Day or Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. I think those are the people he models himself on. You're not allowed, if you're asked what president you personally would wish to be, you're not allowed to mention Lincoln because it's blasphemous by definition.
Even if you come from
even if you're from Illinois or Hawaii, or it doesn't matter where.
Indonesia,
it doesn't matter where you're from, or from Bali. Yeah. But it's no one would do that any more than they would say Washington or Jefferson. But I'm sure that if he had one, that would be it. And the point about Abraham Lincoln was that all his opponents hugely underestimated him, thought he was a blowhard and a big mouth and an easy talker, but didn't have any real nerve or any real vertebrae. I think that's what we're going to find out, and I think that's what the president is between drags reflecting on.
Yes, and I notice he hasn't taken to pitching Nicorette or other nicotine chewing gums.
But the marvelous the secret of the slenderness is now out. I think.
Yes. Although I was watching the college Final Four basketball where they had this guy shooting relentless three-point shots. I'm sure they did a lot of splicing, but it was quite extraordinary to see a tall, slender man shooting baskets from 25 feet. We have about 15 minutes remaining. I would now like to open up to the floor. Before I do so, of course, I just have a couple of reminders. The first one is a reminder. I think it's fair to say that all the people who are here today came to listen not to me, not to the questioner, but to the panellists. So if you could keep your remarks brief, that would be great. And the second thing I have to say is that because this session is being recorded and you don't have mics, you'll have to excuse me if I rephrase and paraphrase your brief and insightful questions. With those comments, let's start further in the back of the room, the gentleman to my left. That's you. Middle of the room. Sorry, it's a woman in the back of the room. I'm sorry, it's a long way down there.
I understand that on the figures that by 2050, Hispanics are going to be the dominant population in the United States. And that's actually not that far away. So I wondered what the current view of the implications of that might be.
Excellent question. So the question was about demography in the US. I think one of the most probably under-known facts about the US is that Latinos are now the largest minority group in the country, not African Americans. Latinos and African Americans typically have had political problems, but Barack Obama won 2/3 of the Latino vote in 2008, helped him win the presidency. If America is becoming a Hispanic country, what does that mean? I guess the question. Anyone want to jump in on this?
Yeah. I find the use of both Hispanic and Latino as portmanteau or all-embracing terms are very misleading. If you go and talk to the Cubans in Miami and then to the El Salvadorans who live in my district, Ward 1 of Washington, D.C., or the Dominicans who live on Long Island, it's true to say that they all have a common language, but that's about the most you can say. The difference between a Mexican and a Guatemalan, for example, very large indeed. White ethnicity is now more or less invisible. No one cares any longer whether someone's from Germany or Poland. It used to matter a hell of a lot there. And with Spanish-speaking American immigrants, these differences are more vivid rather than less. So you beware of aggregating it too much. It's something that needs more disaggregation.
But it is true that there are lots and lots of undocumented workers in the United States, 10 million or so, most of them coming from Mexico, and Mexico is the dominant group in that Latino number. In states like Texas and California, this is already an enormous political reality to become more of one. I know, Don, you spent some time in the Great South and Southwest. What's your sense of the rise of the Spanish-speaking populations in the United States?
I don't have. I'm unqualified, totally, even more than usual on this. I didn't know. Is it Rodriguez writes about? He aggregates them as brown, basically. But that's about as far as I could comment. I know there's a certain paranoia about it. Did you pick up in railway stations and places about how everyone's going to be speaking Spanish soon, we'll all be wrecked?
Yes. The point you did touch upon is very significant, which is the resentment felt by black Americans towards this. It's very, very strong, but very strong in Washington. The worst riot there's ever been in Washington while I've been there was when a black police woman told a young Salvadoran man to put down his beer can in front of his peer group. And he wasn't going to be told to do that by any woman, let alone a black one. And then after he'd been handcuffed, she made the mistake of shooting him. Well, that's always a mistake. You know how that upsets people. But there was then, the whole neighborhood was under curfew for several days, and it was pure hatred between black and Hispanic.
But Anne, I'm sure you'll remember how well Obama did in the racial politics game. He won, I think he won 2/3 of the Asian American votes as well as 2/3 of the Latinos. And a lot of the inside the Beltway types think that if the Democrats can secure the Latino vote, if there is such a thing, leaving aside Cubans in Miami and the like, that's going to make it virtually impossible for Republicans ever to get back the presidency, because those Mountain West states go from being Clint Eastwood gun-toting cowboys to solidly centre-left Latinos. How do you think this demographic change is going to shake out? I mean, obviously Obama is the biggest symbol of it, but there's as the question mentioned, there's a bigger force out there, which is the changing demographics of the country.
Well, it's interesting that Obama has put immigration reform back on the agenda. It's also interesting that George Bush was prepared to run with what some of his own party saw as a far too liberal immigration policy. And George Bush came from Texas. He understood what the pressures were. He understood what it meant politically with the growth in the Hispanic vote, and John McCain too understood that from Arizona. So I think you'll see all those those states along the border that were once, cowboy states, changing quite significantly. And it means that every politician in America has to think about pragmatic ways to deal with its immigration problem, which is, just is so large compared to our tiny problem of boat people arriving.
Yeah, bear in mind, sorry, because it is so interesting, the centre-left assumption may not be as strong as you think. What do we know about these immigrants from Mexico? They want to become members of the American middle class. They have very strong family values. They're much more religious than most, and Catholic too, at that. There's no, things like school vouchers appeal to them a lot. Things like abortion appeal to them hardly at all. They may stay Democratic, but in that case it'll be a different kind of Democratic Party. Yeah,
and it's up to the Republicans, obviously, to manage their nativist anti-immigration concerns, as evidenced by the recent Arizona anti-illegal immigrant bill. Yes, so I hope I can now see a gentleman here in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th row.
Could you comment on Rupert Murdoch's attack on the Obama administration through Fox News?
Fox News, it's not all the news that fits to print. It's fair and balanced, I believe, Fox News. So we're living in a 24/7 media cycle where values of sort of old-style values of reporting seem to be less in favour, and instantaneous punditry seems to be the order of the day. And as a real old-school journalist reporter here, how do you feel about that? 24/7 cable news, politicisation of the news? Breaking down the barriers between commentary and news reporting?
Well, I should say Fox News is now the highest rating cable news service during prime time, which I think says it's clearly working for their audience. And I think you have to understand news it's very competitive, and it's partly about entertainment, and it's partly about, carving out a demographic that appeals to advertisers. So I think Fox News have worked out that there's a group in America that really want to hear its message. And it's, the commentators have also been very successful in becoming major players in politics. I mean, they are some of the spokesmen for the Tea Party movement. And it's a voice that Americans want to hear.
Christopher, how do you feel about this one?
Well, as someone who's brought up in Fleet Street, I can't get very excited about the idea of bias in newspapers. I mean, the British press, and I've even noticed some tendencies of this sort in Australia, can be extremely partisan, and you would be a bloody fool if you didn't know what political party the newspaper you were reading supported, and if that wasn't reflected in its coverage. I can't get too virginal or too maidenly in my disapproval of this kind of thing. What does give me diarrhea, I mean quite acute diarrhea, are the people who say that they are themselves the guardians of objectivity and that can't be challenged. The New York Times every morning has on its front page a thing that says all the news that's fit to print. If that doesn't make you barf, what will? Now, Edward J. Epstein once wrote a very good book on the origins of the American networks. And he did big interviews about all the people who ran them. And it was all complete. He hadn't got a title. And he went to do one final interview with the head of NBC, who said, well, Mr. Epstein, some people report the news from one person's point of view. Others report the news from another person's point of view. We report the news from nobody's point of view. So he had a title. He called the book News from Nowhere. It's that kind of bogus objectivity and neutrality that's to be watched out for. People who let you know where they're coming from are fine by me.
Okay, so the heavens have opened above us. People are walking outside us. Perhaps that's a good time for one last question. I don't know how I've done in my sweep here, but I think we would come back to the front here. And how about the gentleman in the front row? Beg your pardon? All right, the gentleman I can barely see in the back of the room. Last question. Please shout.
Ma'am.
I cannot hear you, I'm sorry.
I can. He's saying there's a question for Comrade Hitchens.
Oh, there we go.
I have ears like a bat for that kind of thing.
Your antenna raises on Comrade Hitchens? Okay.
But you might give it some welly, sir.
Yeah.
Produce it up a bit.
Against all odds, I have to say.
Before I ask my question, could you hang around for 5 to get me to sign a couple of books?
Oh, I'm supposed to say, I think there are lots and lots of book signing opportunities for you all outside, presided over by Glebe Books.
And also, I want to publicly thank Comrade Hitchens for his...
Comrade Hitchens has been publicly thanked. I don't think that sounds like a question to me. Is there a question? How about right here?
No, it means there's a but coming.
I have a question.
Okay, last chance. Going once, going twice.
On Obama's lack of leadership on Arizona, offensive legislation against Spanish-speaking, basically Spanish-speaking people.
Yeah, I think we do.
Basically nothing about it.
Yeah, well, I think the panel actually did just refer to it. The US Congress is reintroducing legislation provoked by the Arizona legislation, which I think many people in the United States find repugnant. Is that it?
Yeah.
We're going once?
Yeah, now we'll be nice only to people with receipts.
We're going twice?
The pro bono bit is over. Thanks for coming. Bye. Gotta go. No,
that's it? All right, we're out. I didn't get to end the session. Thank you all. Thank our panelists. Thank you so much for being in the audience.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.